I'm personally very interested in the art, the business and the science of improvisation, because there are people have to cope with the uncertainty and change. Now, if I look at your website, I see you're a jazz pianist, you were a management consultant, and you published, I think, over 100 scientific articles and 17 books, including Group Genius. Now, it seems to me that you're fascinated about creativity and collaboration, learning and improvisation. Now, what is it that fascinates you about these topics?
You're exactly right. I am fascinated with creativity and creativity as a performance, improvisation, as you say, the uncertainty. And uncertainty we often think of as unpleasant, and it can be unpleasant, but there's potential in the ambiguity and uncertainty. There's potential for surprising new opportunities to emerge unpredictably, and that's a big part of breakthrough creativity. So I'm very lucky, I think, that I've been able to create a career as a researcher where I study creativity scientifically. It goes all the way back for me to a young age when I was taking piano lessons and then learned how to play jazz piano after many years of playing in the European tradition, the classical music we call it, and then teaching myself how to improvise. It's fairly common for improvisational jazz musicians to learn themselves without formal training, and that's what I ended up doing. So that experience of learning how to improvise, and it was so different from performing from a written score. The written score you could think of as predictable, right? Because you know exactly what notes are supposed to be played, whereas improvisation is unpredictable, it's uncertain. And I think that's where the study of improvisation has some relevance now for this interest in concern for unpredictability.
And I think you once described it in your video that you trained 8 years of classical piano, and then you discovered a jazz ensemble in which there are no scripts and no notes, and you have to relearn everything. So what is the difference between classical piano and jazz piano? Because it's both, you need both the skills of playing the piano, but what is the difference to regarding the script or unscripted piano?
You're right. I did have many years of the classical piano training with a weekly lesson and then practicing at home to make sure you would play the Beethoven or the Mozart exactly correctly. And a lot of the focus was performing to a standard of sound and tone and rhythm that would match the conventional and expected performance. And I got very good at doing that. And I became known within my high school, my secondary school, for being a good pianist. And in many American high schools, the large ones especially, they will have an 18-piece jazz ensemble. And one of your daily classes will be a 1-hour class with the jazz ensemble as an elective. So the band needed a pianist, and somehow the director found it out that I knew how to play piano. So I was invited to be the jazz pianist. But on the first day, the very first class of the fall semester, I sat down at the piano. The band director put the music in front of me, and I couldn't perform it because there were no notes. On a jazz chart, it's very common for the 5 bars of the staff to be completely empty. And above the staff, you have the chord symbol, which might be a C chord or a C7 chord. And that's all that was given to me. And I did not know how to play from chords. I didn't know how to improvise the notes myself. So I really did have to go through an experience almost of learning like a different instrument. And it's taken, well, I'm still learning. It's taken my whole life to learn better and better how to do this. It began, of course, it's hard to improvise by yourself, but then very quickly I realized that jazz is an ensemble art form and that you perform with other musicians. When I first started doing that, it enhances the difficulty because not only are you improvising, but you have to listen to the other musicians and then respond to what they're doing to make the ensemble have a good collective sound. And that enhances the cognitive challenge. So at first, that made another level of difficulty. First of all, I had to improvise myself, which was hard to learn. And then secondly, I had to improvise while listening to other musicians, and that was also very difficult. But as I became more advanced in performing jazz, I began to realize the benefits of playing with other musicians, that it's not so much of a challenge as it is a gift from the other musicians who give you ideas. It's important that you don't know what they're going to play, because that surprise when you hear will awaken something in you that allows you to create a melodic phrase you would not have come up with if you were performing alone.
Now, is there something like an improvisational skill that you learned, or how did you learn to improvise coming from classical piano?
It was a lot of time and effort. I think it's like learning almost anything. It takes effort, it takes work. I don't think there's any necessary gift or magic to it. It was a lot of effort. Practicing an hour a day is maybe a minimum for someone who hopes to learn and then maintain that ability. Uh, so, like I said, I did play for that 1 year. It was my last year of high school, and I learned, I got well enough uh, to play successfully. And then when I went on to university, it's also very common for the universities in the U.S. to have an 18-piece jazz orchestra. So I auditioned for that group, and that was at my university was MIT. I auditioned for that group and became the pianist there for 3 years. And then the 18-piece group is, of course, a very large band, and it's more common for people to be familiar with the small group jazz with maybe 4 or 5 musicians. And I enjoy that more because the piano stands out a little bit more than with the 18-piece group. Mostly you listen to the trumpets and saxophones and trombones. With the smaller ensemble, it's often called the rhythm section. For a large band, we are the rhythm section, but for a small group, that's the entire ensemble, maybe with one horn player as the soloist at the front of the group. You typically would have a saxophone player. So that was, again, like learning yet another way of playing. The big band playing is different from what you would play with a small group. And each style that you play, whether it's from the 1940s or from the 1960s, you're improvising in a different style, just like if you were playing Mozart or playing Beethoven, they're very different centuries. So you need to learn each one distinctively, I think. So there's never a point where you've learned everything.
Now, improvisation can be applied in music, like you described, but also in theater, like improv theater, or in dance, but also in entrepreneurship, in which people have to improvise more or less daily, or innovation, or emergency forces. And in every discipline, they describe it in a bit a different way, but sometimes it seems that there's a common ground on improvisation. So from your perspective, what is or if there is a core of improvisation, what could that be?
I think so. I think there is a core of improvisation, and I think that the principles, especially of group improvisation, will work from one context to another. And I discovered this from entering creativity research after an experience as a jazz ensemble pianist and becoming familiar with research on collaboration and conversational dynamics. And then as a management consultant, learning more about how innovation takes place in large organizations. And I saw the connections, right, that this is so similar. And that led me to write a book that's primarily for business leaders. That was called Group Genius, which originally was published in 2007. And at that time, businesses were only just beginning to realize this idea of improvisation and uncertainty being necessary for innovation. So a big contrast for me was between planning and improvising. In large organizations, executives are trained to plan carefully. And they develop a business plan, they develop a budget for 1 or 2 or 3 years. They know how to assign each worker to a very specific set of tasks. And what I learned from the research in organizations is that this style of planning is inconsistent with innovation. It really just never happens. Maybe you get lucky and it could happen occasionally. But to consistently generate innovation and effective change in organizations, you need to have an organizational structure that welcomes and fosters the kind of improvisational flow of the organization. So I'd say that's one of the universal characteristics, is the contrast between planning for something that I would call scripted, where it's written out ahead of time for the next 3 years. Here's what we'll be doing as a business. And then the environment changes and your 3-year plan is no longer effective, and it's only been 1 year. So now you've wasted all that planning effort. The organizations that are consistent innovators have figured out a way to tap into the power of improvisation and flexibility. And it's not the case that there should be no planning. Organizations do need some planning and some structure, but the innovation will always come from the openness to improvisation. So I'd say that's one big contrast, planning versus flexibility. Another big contrast that I find in all improvisational forms is a contrast between a linear process and an improvisational process. And by linear process, I think of, imagine creativity being about having a big flash of insight. You have the big idea and the light bulb goes off over your head, and that's the moment of creativity. And then you have the organization execute your idea. The execution part is not that creative, right? But it was the brilliant insight that was the creativity. That I call a linear model of creativity, where it goes idea all the way through to creating the product. That's a misconception, I think, about creativity, particularly in organizations, that you should not expect to start with the big idea, but you engage in a process over time where small ideas emerge during the work. And it's those small ideas, when they come together, gradually a bigger innovation emerges.
Now, the world changed in the last months dramatically, and the plans from January are not applicable anymore some month later. And it seems to me that people and organizations have to improvise much more than before. So what kind of skills, what kind of mindsets or structure do people and organizations need to deal with this uncertainty?
So you mean if you are in an organization that's not used to doing this, and let's say you're a leader and I've convinced you that you need to be different, is that right? Then what would my advice be?
So in most organizations that I know, at least, are more structured, do not improvise. They have the clear plans, they have the linear innovation processes like you described, and suddenly the environment changed and they have to adapt. They have to think on their feet. They have, I think it's like you described, from a piano player trained to have the classical music suddenly has to collaborate with others and being creative and try to adapt. And I think they have to do the same, like you described, to relearn again. But how can they do that?
Right, I understand. It's a big challenge, and I think it's very hard to do when you're at a point where you're at risk. If you have not taken a more innovative approach, which would be a sort of organizational dynamic with some flexibility and openness to improvisation. If you're not that kind of organization and you get to a point where you're losing money, your customers are leaving, you're at risk of bankruptcy, it might be too late. I could give some advice depending on the specifics, but my real advice would be the best time to innovate is when you're successful and when you're thriving and when you're making money and you have profits available. And it's that extra resources that are the right time to invest in a new kind of organizational process. So what I see successful organizations who've made this transition, they are often already at the top of that industry. And they got to the top because they were very good at planning and being structured. And then a visionary leader realizes, we might not stay at the top if we keep doing this. So let's take the advantage of being very successful and getting to the next future, which probably won't be the same linear and structured process that has gotten us to this peak. So that's where I'd like to think organizations are more likely to make that transition and it's difficult, right? Because you're successful. And so your natural tendency is to keep doing what has made you successful. And those organizations, there are very often stories about how those organizations eventually failed. I guess you could say overconfidence, but it's more complicated than that. But yeah.
Now, this crisis or pandemic is just one case, but it seems to be plausible that in future there are other waves or changes coming. And I think people and organizations have to think how to prepare for such unexpected situations. And some people ask, like, can I learn to be creative? Can I learn to improvise? And if so, how? What is your answer if people say, like, they would like to prepare for unexpected situations, but is it possible? And if yes, how?
Yes, I absolutely think it's possible. And you mentioned this pandemic no one could have anticipated. Although I have recently read an article about the founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates, who at his private foundation has been telling political and business leaders for many years now that a pandemic is a real possibility. I didn't realize that until I read this article in our newspaper called the New York Times. So I suppose at least one person could predict, but you still don't know when. For me, it came out of nowhere, right? I'm teaching a class at my university, and just one day, the university leader said, we will not meet in classrooms anymore. You have to move all of your classes onto the internet. And I knew how to do that because I had done it before, but still it takes a lot of time to transfer your face-to-face instruction to online. And then I have colleagues who aren't very familiar with computers, and they had a very difficult time making this transition. So completely unexpected, right? And that's not even, when you talk about the face of uncertainty, a lot of what we see in the world, we know what the uncertainty is, right? We can see, well, are we going to have enough food? How rapidly is the climate going to get worse? So we know what the problem is, but we're still uncertain. And here's a case where we didn't know that this problem was coming. at all, and then we have to respond improvisationally. It's very difficult for people. Psychological research shows that people do not like uncertainty. When there's uncertainty, people respond with anxiety, and anxiety is an unpleasant state. So most of us, our natural inclination is to attempt to reduce the uncertainty and thereby reducing our anxiety level. So I think a first step is to recognize that this is happening, that yes, I am becoming uncomfortable, and here's why. It's the uncertainty of the situation, and it's making me anxious. And then to develop some awareness of how you could manage the way you think about that uncertainty, to view it in some way as an opportunity. Of course, in some cases, the uncertainty is completely negative, like, am I going to die from this new virus? In most cases, there are more complexity, where the uncertainty has the potential to result in some very positive things, also has potential to result in negative things. So it takes some, I don't know, self-discipline to manage this natural tendency to become anxious, and then to attempt to impose structure and order on your environment. And that would be my main advice, is to, first of all, recognize that you're doing this. Second, realize that it's natural and everyone will do it. And then third, to take some steps to develop an ability to respond in a more improvisational and creative way. But everybody can learn this, absolutely. It's hard though, it's difficult.
Now, you did a lot research on education and creativity. And still, if I look at universities and schools, I hardly find any course on creativity, collaboration, improvisation, and so on, at least in Europe. So my last question would be, what would your recommendation be for our education system to that people learn about creativity, collaboration, or improvisation?
It's absolutely critical that we have this in our schools, I believe. And there is a long tradition of schools teaching knowledge as fixed and static. And the student's responsibility is to absorb this information as it is and memorize it, to be simplistic, and then be able to demonstrate that they have internalized this information. So there's no creativity in this model of learning at all. Unfortunately, schools have been this way for a very long time. And I'm positive and optimistic now, because I do think everyone realizes that this is a problem. When I say everyone, I mean the people who have power to make a difference, right? Politicians, business leaders. I have advocated for this for many years, but I'm not in power. So when I see people at senior levels of society believing, and I think they really do believe, one can be cynical, right? But I think they really do believe that this is important, yes, for our economy, but also for the future of the planet, to be able to respond to these types of uncertainty that you described. So I've advocated reforming our schools. And just last year, I published a book called The Creative Classroom, which is based on my research in the science of how people learn, combined with research on how creativity works, what goes on in the mind when people are being creative. And I guess the short message, I would say that creativity is embedded in knowledge. So I don't think creativity is something free floating, or it doesn't stand alone as an ability. You learn to be creative at doing something. So I learned to be creative at improvising on piano. There's not really any evidence that being a good improviser on piano will make me a more creative at physics, right? Or at mathematics. We call that domain general creativity, means that you could learn to be creative and it would apply to any domain or any discipline. But all the evidence is that creativity is domain specific, that the best way to learn to be creative is to learn knowledge in a given area in a way that prepares you to be creative. So if you're going to school and you're memorizing all of the physics facts and formulas, that is the wrong kind of knowledge to be creative in physics. So you have mastered this memorization of physics knowledge as something static. If you then take a creativity class, I think it's too late. I don't think your creativity class can overcome the fact that you've learned the wrong kind of knowledge. So I advocate for every subject to be taught in a different kind of way so that students will learn an adaptive and flexible understanding of the material. And that it's that deeper understanding that prepares a person to go beyond knowledge and create with what they've learned.